museum goes back to Winthrop Rockefeller. And yeah, I'm sure you all are familiar with him. He was the grandson of oil baron John D. Rockefeller. So he had money. He came to Arkansas in 1953, and he adopted this state as his home. He fell in love with Petit Jean, built a ranch up here, and more comes from that. This museum is part of the story. In 1960, his friend James Melton, who was a famous opera singer and movie star, who had been collecting cars for decades, old vintage cars, he decided he was going to sell his collection. And so Winthrop Rockefeller decided to buy 40 or so of those cars. And that ended up forming the core, the basis of what then became this museum's collections initially. Now, he got the cars. He wanted then to have a showcase for them, a showroom, and that's why he built this museum in 1964. It opened up. We'll talk about the architecture in a bit, but just suffice it to say for now that as you look around, you don't see interior support columns. That was intentional. He wanted it to be an open space for the cars. So we'll get into the magic of that towards the end. On with the history. He's opening this museum, the grand opening, in October 1964. So that means that 2 weeks ago, y'all celebrated its 60th anniversary. I think that's really special. This was just like it is now. Back then, it was election season. And Rockefeller was running for governor of the state of Arkansas. And he took time out of his busy campaigning schedule to do the grand opening. It was officially not a political event. But you got to think that he probably thought that it was a good look, you know, because he is trying to do something for the state of Arkansas. His motivation, he described himself as not an old car buff. His motivation, as he put it, was to give something for Arkansas, a tourist attraction, something to bring people in and have them spend their money in Conway County and the surrounding region. That grand opening also coincided with the first annual Antique Automobile Fair, October 17th and 18th, 1964. And the initial exhibit was about 38 cars, mostly from the Melton collection, plus some other cars that Rockefeller had obtained. They had all been restored and they were in running condition. Now, here's an interesting detail. For the first 6 years of the museum's existence, the staff made it a point to, they kept these cars up in meticulous operating condition. They made it a point to take one car out every day, as much as possible, and drive it around the mountain, 10 miles or so sometimes. And this was done on a rotational basis so that every month or so, each car in the collection was getting driven. And they maintained this daily activity for 6 years, according to one of the early directors. But I believe they continued to drive the cars at least occasionally after that, because it was something that was important to them. Staff kept the cars so well maintained, one person was employed full-time just to polish the brass fixtures on the cars. And if you ask them about the brass fixtures, they will say that they require a lot of maintenance, a lot of care.
Hands-on.
Hands-on care. The cars in that exhibit ranged from the 1860s on up to more recent eras. The 1860s, I mean, we're talking about the dawn of the automobile age. The original director of the museum was Alan Simmons. Is that the right pronunciation? Simons? And he was director from 66 to, I believe, around 68, and then Buddy Holzman became the director. And then he was director for a good number of years. The museum attained renown quite early on, and it maintained it. It was seen as quite a nice attraction. The national media picked up on the museum's opening in the early days. Well, I mean, obviously the collection involved some nationally known figures, such as James Melton, such as Winthrop Rockefeller, and so there's the star power. But it was also seen as a legitimately good quality collection of a subject that people are interested in, the antique automobiles. The Mid-America Old Time Automobile Association began having their annual auto fair and swap meet. They had been having this annual fair every year since, I believe, the 1950s. Beginning in 1968, this museum became their home, like permanent place for these annual meetings, and this is their headquarters. Motor Trend magazine wrote a piece on the museum in May 1966, calling the Rockefeller collection already one of the country's best while still in its infancy, and saying that Arkansas is the home of as finely a restored group of rare cars as can be found anywhere. But the Motor Trend article went on to say that the Melton collection, which formed the core of this, had been obtained in as abominable condition as museum pieces go, needing much expensive restoration, which they did put that in. But Rockefeller had also purchased several old-time race cars from a Providence, Rhode Island collector named George Waterman. And these, the magazine rated as meticulously restored, the finest collection of vintage racers extant anywhere. In addition to the Melton and Waterman collections, the Winthrop Rockefeller had also obtained, I think, around 8 other cars from family members. Some of these were cars that he or they had grown up riding in, and so they had some nostalgic value. In addition, the museum displayed other cars on loan from private collectors. The idea here was to represent the evolution of the automobile through time and to see the different stages of its development. And then also to rotate the exhibits out so that it's not always the same static collection, so that people can visit over and over and see something new. And the museum still does that today. The logo that you've seen, as you drive in, and there's billboards proclaiming the Museum of Automobiles, or you may see promotional material that has the logo. That's basically the same as it's always been. You look at old advertisements from the 1960s, from the early days of the museum, same logo with the wheel over the hanging roof of the museum. In late 1965 or early 1966, the museum was having a bit of a hard time with the tires on their cars because they're driving them all the time, and even undriven, as Motor Trend magazine says, even tires on museum cars dry up and crack every 7 years or so. They're going to need to be replaced. This is not a permanent piece of the item. And so where do you get tires for cars that they don't make anymore? And they were having a hard time keeping up with that. And so they decided, let's just make our own tires in our own factory. In 1965-66, they created the PJA Pneumatic Factory down here in the museum basement. PJA stood for Petit Jean Attractions, which was the parent, I guess, of this museum, and then PJA Pneumatic was the tire factory. They Rockefeller bought the Garrick Tire Company's factory in Harlan, Indiana, and had it delivered out here to Petit Jean. The equipment was 40 years old, but it was still working fine, so they just used it. They planned on making 10,000 to 15,000 tires per year and ship them around the nation and the world, because it wasn't only this museum. There was a market for these antique tires. I'm not sure that they ran this factory very long, because I believe in 1968 they sold it. Sold it to the Universal Tire Company out of Pennsylvania, all the molds, all the equipment, and it's still in operation. Still in operation. So it was 40 years old then, and this was 60 years ago. While it was in operation here, visitors to the museum could go down and watch through a window, watch them making the tires. And I've got a picture that I found in Motor Trend magazine of that factory. You can see them making historic tires. And I'm going to pass this around. Maybe I'll start on this side. If you just want to pass it around and let everybody have a look at that. That photo is from 1966. Here's some facts and some anecdotes about some of the noteworthy cars in the museum to give you a flavor of what the museum was and what it offered, and some of the ways the museum operated. During the 1966 gubernatorial campaign, Rockefeller ran for governor again in 1966. He did not win in 1964. He did win in 1966 and became our governor. During that campaign, he used 3 cars from the museum to draw attention. One of them was the 1914 Creeder's roadside popcorn wagon, which is actually still in the collection. It's back in that corner, and it's really quite a remarkable piece. You'll have to go check it out. So he brought those down to Little Rock as kind of showpieces to gain some attention for his campaign. The museum was also used, the autos in the museum were also used to promote the state of Arkansas. For example, in 1968, I believe, it was called the Hemisphere, World's Fair in San Antonio. And outside the Arkansas Pavilion, they had one of the vehicles from the Museum of Automobiles there too. In the late 1960s, an antique car collector from Little Rock named Atlee Davis found a rare 1920 Climber automobile in a barn in Oklahoma. He bought it, fixed it up, and sold it to Rockefeller for display here in the Museum of Automobiles. How many of y'all have heard of the Climber car company? Okay, several of you. And this is great too, because I also am going to get to tell the story to people who don't yet know. Climber, to that time, was the only car manufacturer that had ever been based out of Arkansas. It operated in Little Rock from 1919 to 1923. The factory is still there. We've got a YouTube video, Sandwiching History Tour, back in the virtual days, where you can see that, see the factory where they made these cars. It went out of business, but during the time it was in business, it produced about 200 cars. And these cars were meant to be like rugged and tough for all the rough roads that Arkansas had, and you know, they were good to climb up mountains like Petit Jean, and they did all kinds of publicity stunts with the Climber. It's quite a really interesting car. But in the 1960s, when he found this, it was thought to be the only one left in existence. And so this was quite a prize for the museum to have. Remember the name Atlee Davis? He's going to come up again. The museum also sometimes provided historic cars from its collection to be used in movies. 4 1930s era cars were lent for the Shelley Winters movie Bloody Mama, which was filmed in Arkansas. And in 1972, film star Rock Hudson was injured in an accident involving a car from this museum. Rockefeller had loaned his 1900 steam-powered locomobile, a very rare vehicle, to Universal Studios because of his friendship with producer George Seaton. Hudson was, I guess, going to use it in the film, and so he was learning to drive it, but it was difficult to drive, and he had an accident. And in this accident, he damaged the vehicle and broke his own leg and wrist and made news headlines. In the end, they decided, Rockefeller offered a replacement vehicle for use in the movie, but they decided just to cut the scene. They never made it in. The museum was popular, but by 1968, Rockefeller was saying that it isn't performing the way it should. He didn't want to sell it, but he was playing around with the idea of leasing it to someone in Hot Springs. And at times he also talked about someday donating it to the state of Arkansas. Visitation in that era was about 50,000, 54,000 a year on average. It might have reached up to 80,000. So that gives you a bit of a ballpark. I mean, it was attracting visitors, but it just wasn't quite breaking even. Fortunately, it had a wealthy backer. But Rockefeller died on February 22nd, 1973, relatively young. I think he was about 60 years old. And this was 2 years after he completed his second term as governor. He was still a force in the state, but when he passed away from cancer, the question was what would become of the museum. We're going to examine that in a second, but more immediately, the museum became the site for his memorial service. The antique cars from the showroom floor were all removed down to the basement, and 2,000 folding chairs were set up in here. The museum was decorated with large sprays of flowers and banks of greenery. Visitors came and flooded in. When the 2,000 chairs were full, it became standing room only. Several hundred people stood around, and when they reached max capacity, it overflowed out front, and there were more folding chairs set up around the fountain, and those outside listened to the ceremony on the loudspeaker. At one point, it got to where there were just so many people filling up the grounds that the police had to turn them away. It was said that estimated about between 3,000 and 5,000 people attended this funeral. And I've heard that you can actually view it on YouTube. I did not know that till today. That's great. Dignitaries from around the country came to pay their respects. Vice President Spiro Agnew was here, along with 3 governors and 2 former governors from Arkansas and various other states. Of course, the entire Rockefeller family was here. One of those governors was Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York, brother of Winthrop. And at this point, I would like to invite Kathy Andrews to tell us some anecdotes about Winthrop Rockefeller, to just kind of give us a flavor of who this man was. If it's all right, let me give you this headset. If you can speak into the microphone.
Hello.
You can turn it up too.
I'm fine. Hello. I've been here just a little over a year, and since I spent 32 years at the school bus factory, so I knew absolutely nothing about cars. But since I've been working here, I've got the fever. I can't get enough of it, and I really love the history, and so I've done a lot of research. And Mr. Rockefeller, when he moved here, he was looking for a quieter life. He had no plans of getting involved in politics. He moved here and started a farm, and he showed up at a time when we didn't have a future. We had no jobs. We had no prospects for any jobs. But he showed up, and the 4 years he was our governor, he created 90,000 jobs for our state, our first minimum wage law, prison reform, and he was involved in the civil rights movement big time. But what I really found fascinating was I watched an interview with his brother Nelson. He has 4 brothers, Lawrence, David, John III, and Nelson. Winthrop was the baby. When they were growing up, Winthrop had dyslexia. And Nelson in the interview said that him and Lawrence, they were the oldest, said that they teased Winthrop, that he wasn't as smart as them. And he said he was so proud of Winthrop for what he did in Arkansas, because out of the 5 boys, they thought he was going to be the one least likely to be successful. And so that was absolutely amazing. Also, my mother-in-law worked for him at the farm. She helped run the switchboard, and she told me that he did not treat them like hired help. They were treated like royalty. She said they didn't have to bring their lunch or buy their drinks. He furnished all of that. And let's see, let's get to I heard you mention the popcorn wagon. I was told the popcorn wagon is the most expensive vehicle in here. There were only 9 built. There's only 4 known left in existence, and one of them sold at an auction a year and a half ago for $440,000. And I was told it didn't have all the bells and whistles that this one did. And when Mr. Rockefeller passed, they held his memorial service in here. You can go on YouTube and see a little bit of the footage from it. It's all black and white, but you can definitely tell that it's in here because you see these lights up here on the beams. And when y'all get ready to leave, I do have a photograph. If y'all would like to see it, just ask me and I will show it to you, for those of y'all that want to look at it. And he's also responsible for the utilities up here. He brought the water and the gas up here. I was told by a gentleman that came in that back in the day, before the roads were paved, that when they went down the mountain, they had to tie a tree trunk to the back of their vehicles coming down this mountain to slow them down, because they said back then brakes weren't that great. Yeah. So I thought, wow, they were brave. But like I say, I didn't know anything about cars one weekend. I didn't have anything. There was nothing on TV. And I wanted to know the difference in the Model A and the Model T. And this was after I got down on the floor looking, you know, just visually trying to figure it out on my own. And I went on YouTube and researched them. And there's a whole page of the difference in the Model A and the Model T. But one of the most obvious differences for y'all that don't know is your Model A, your gas cap's always going to be in the center of the hood, in the middle of the windshield, and on your Model T, it's underneath the passenger seat. So that's a little something I've learned since I've been here. But, and I'm also trying to learn to recognize I've learned a lot of these cars, like the Chevelles, the Challenger, the 442. You know, I had it in my mind, I knew what a 70 442 looked like, but when I come in here and seen all these model cars, I'm like, no, that's a Chevelle. It looks like a Challenger. I was informed you got to learn the grills and the back end. You got to learn how to recognize that, because a lot of them do have the same body. So I'm learning, but like I say, I've just been absolutely fascinated by the history. And Mr. Rockefeller's grandsons were born and raised here. Will is on our board of directors, and his brother Colin is building a house on the west side of the mountain near the family home. He owns the Packard here. Him and his mother were in here about 6 weeks ago, and he shared with me that there's only 74 miles on that Packard.
Oh, wow.
I told him that I tell all the customers that's one of the cars you pull up beside somebody and say, do you have any gray coupons? He just started cracking up laughing. Of course, the young people don't even know what gray coupon is. But that's about it. Usually what I tell is in your brochure there. I usually tell all of that about why this is in the middle of nowhere and all that. But yeah, I just can't get enough of the history. I'm just absolutely fascinated by it. And Winthrop was governor of Arkansas at the same time Nelson was governor of New York. And one little other thing I'll share, I was watching with my interview with Nelson. He said when they were growing up on Wednesdays, every Wednesday, their parents made them do the shopping, and they had to cook the meal on every Wednesday. The boys did. So, you know, they were brought up, and they wore a lot of hand-me-down clothing, too. They didn't get new clothes. They wore hand-me-down clothes. But they are so down to earth. When they come in here to visit, they sit down there and crack jokes with you and talk to you like you've been living next door to them all your life. I mean, they're just so down to earth. Not snooty, none whatsoever. They're really good people. Well, that's about all I got.
I really appreciate that perspective. It actually reminded me of a story that my dad told. Now, my dad lives in western Oklahoma. He grew up there, and he said that from this little bitty small town area of western Oklahoma, there was a local boy who became Winthrop Rockefeller's veterinarian for his ranch out here, and that, you know, a house was provided for him and everything. Sometimes he would go back to Oklahoma to see relatives and tell what it was like living here. He said, I'm not even allowed to change a light bulb when a light bulb needs changing. He's got someone that does that for me. So they were really, I guess, Rockefeller really took care of his people. So the museum, again, it was only 9 years old at the time of Rockefeller's passing. It was still young, but because it was so tied to his identity and dependent on his money, you know, the big question is what will happen to it next, now that he's gone. Trustees were named as executors of Rockefeller's estate. His will commissioned them to handle the estate according to their judgment of how best to honor his legacy of investing in the causes that he believed in. Rockefeller's interests and assets, as you can imagine, were vast, and so the trustees, this wasn't going to be a quick, easy process, and they were taking their time with it. Meanwhile, the museum just kept doing business as usual, admitting visitors, maintaining cars, rotating out exhibits, hosting the annual auto fair and swap meet, expanding the collections. 2 of Rockefeller's personal cars were added to the collection at this time. They immediately went on display, although one of them was not yet very old. But one was the 1951 Cadillac Fleetwood 75 that he arrived in Arkansas in 1953. The other was his 1967 Cadillac limousine with a custom hood ornament of a solid silver Santa Gertrudis bull, which was the kind of cattle that he raised here. And these cars are still on display. Downstairs, the museum installed an antique drugstore and souvenir shop. Now, one source I read said, like, it implied that this was happening in the 70s after his death. Was it already there? Or, you know?
I'm not sure. The last time we toured that.
Okay. So downstairs there is an antique drugstore. The story behind the drugstore is that his wife, Jeanette, in 1967, for their 11th anniversary, she was down in Stamps, Arkansas, for a speaking engagement, and she fell in love with the Baker drugstore and decided to buy the interior, to buy the fixtures and furnishings, and she had them shipped up here to give as a gift to Winthrop for their anniversary. That drugstore had been in constant operation from 1902 until 1967 when she bought it. So it's there now, and they also paired it with a souvenir shop. Meanwhile, this question, what will happen to the museum, hangs over Arkansas, and the state was the state was anticipating what will become of it because people cared. In late 1974, a consultant for the trustees recommended that the museum and all of its contents be turned over to the state. This would be valued at between $1 million and $2.5 million, depending on the source you read. That was what I found. The Department of Parks and Tourism was ready to accept it if offered. Although the museum had been operating at a slight loss, and the state didn't want to take on a liability, Parks and Tourism Director William Henderson said he thought that the museum could be self-sustaining, or at least break even, but he couldn't guarantee. It was expensive to operate. But the state could probably do it more cheaply because they wouldn't have to pay taxes, and they also would have to reduce the salaries of the 10 full-time employees so that they would be fit into the state compensation scale. You know how that goes. The estate trustees expressed an interest in this outcome, that it would become state property, but they clarified it was one of many options that they were exploring. Certain conditions would have to be met, which Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Commission agreed to, and the transfer would also have to be approved by both the governor, Dale Bumpers, and the Legislative Council. Again, both of those expressed interest. Nevertheless, some saw it as a risky move. They argued that the museum could never be profitable, located as it was on an out-of-the-way mountaintop, and therefore not accessible to community. Perhaps the Hot Springs Advertising and Promotion Commission realized that with the state's position being maybe iffy, they sent the trustees a telegram expressing their interest in having the museum collection turned over to the city of Hot Springs in the event that things didn't work out with the state. Their claim was that Hot Springs is the leading tourist area of Arkansas and that there's a larger potential for visitors than there is on Petit Jean. Another year went by. In late 1975, the trustees made their decision. Perhaps the state officials had not shown enough confidence in that the museum wouldn't be a liability because in the end, the executors didn't entrust the collection to the state, the cars, to the state. To the surprise of the Parks and Tourism Department and others, nearly all of the antique auto collection was sold to Harrah's Museum in Reno, Nevada, which had around 1,500 classic cars. The executors announced that the sale was more in keeping with the charitable priorities expressed by Governor Rockefeller. Others argued that keeping the cars here and keeping this tourist attraction open for the people of Arkansas and for tourism was also in keeping with his goals and ideals. More than 70 of Rockefeller's 82 cars were sold. They brought in $947,000 for the Winthrop Rockefeller Charitable Trust, and So it also did good things for the state. That one-of-a-kind climber also went to Harrah's. So now the only car that had ever been made in Arkansas is now out of state. With the building now not much more than an empty garage, the museum had to close. The following year, 1976, the trustees then donated this building, the Museum of Automobiles, to the state. The Department of Parks and Tourism gladly accepted it, but knowing it was designed specifically to exhibit antique cars and would have limited other uses, they just decided that they would keep it in that vein. They leased it to a group of 10 Arkansas antique car collectors under a newly created nonprofit organization called the Museum of Automobiles Incorporated. And that is the organization that still runs this museum. The building still belongs to the state, and the Museum of Automobiles Incorporated still runs the museum as a nonprofit. Well, the public reaction to the closing of the popular museum resulted now in an outpouring of donations and support for the new museum, helping them off to a solid launch. Other than the cars on display, which were a new collection for the most part, not much outwardly changed from the old museum. They continue to do what they had been doing with that year hiatus. So when the museum reopened in June of 1976, it had 35 cars, mostly on loan from collectors, as well as those remaining from the original Rockefeller collection. And they had plans to increase the display to 48 cars by later in the year. The museum has always said that about 50 cars is probably the sweet spot for having the right balance of visible cars out here. And so what's not on display is stored downstairs. In 1977, the Museum of Automobiles got another climber. Atlee Davis, who had sold that 1920 climber to the museum in the 1960s, which was then later sold to Harrah's in Reno. They had thought that was the only one left, but lo and behold, he found another one in Oklahoma, a 1923 six-cylinder. So he bought and restored that one and donated it to the museum. The earlier 1920 climber, they managed in 1989, one of the Museum of Automobiles board members managed to buy it back as well. And so now both known climbers that still exist, the only two, are in the collection of this museum. One is on display up here, one is downstairs. Meanwhile, the Mid-America Old Time Automobile Association was continuing to use the museum as its national headquarters and host the annual Antique Auto Show and swap meet, as they always had been. That meet had started with about 2,000 participants in the 60s, and it was drawing around 25,000 by the 80s and nearly 100,000, I believe, by the 90s. I don't know what it currently stands at, but it's a popular event. In 1993, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton was elected to the presidency, and as he moved to Washington, D.C., he sent his beloved 1967 Ford Mustang to the Museum of Automobiles for display and safekeeping while he was away. The idea, I guess, was to pick it back up when he came back to Arkansas, but it's still here. Is it not? No, that one's not. It's a different one. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Okay.
It actually owns the Kennedy.
Okay.
It's part of the Bill Clinton Foundation.
The vehicle I got mixed up on was John F. Kennedy's,
John F. Kennedy's
and
car.
it belongs to the Clinton Foundation. Okay, yes. So Clinton took his car back. You missed your chance to see it. But as you probably know, this museum isn't just interesting because of cars, or even because of the history behind it, because that's great. But it's actually quite significant for its mid-century modern architecture. Most people who visit it probably notice instinctively right off the bat that it's not a typical design. But unless you happen to be someone that really pays attention to architecture or structural engineering, you might just hurry to the cars and not really ask the question of why was it constructed this way? When Winthrop Rockefeller decided to build a museum to house his automobile collection, he turned to the firm of Ginocchio, Cromwell, Carter, Dees, and Neelan, who had designed his home and his farm. So he already had a relationship with them, and he knew that they could provide what he wanted. They put two of their most talented architects, Dietrich Nieland and Robert Millet, on the design of the project, with Oliver Gatchel doing the engineering. And because the client needed a large open space to display the cars, support pillars in the interior would obstruct the view. Rockefeller didn't want it to look like a grocery store. Their bold solution, therefore, was to use a tensile cable structural system to suspend the roof from the building's four corners. The tensile cable concept is relatively simple. You see it in a tent or a suspension bridge. Those kinds of constructions have been used for a long time, but it wasn't until the late 1800s that Russian engineer Vladimir Zhukov developed one of the first practical calculations of stresses and deformations of tensile structures. He used the principles of structures for his constructions in the 1896 Nizhny Novgorod Fair, but it didn't gain widespread application until the late 20th century, starting with German architect Fry Otto's West German Pavilion at Expo 67 and the Olympic Stadium in 1972. 1967, 1972, that's after the construction date of this museum, is when this kind of architecture really sort of comes into its own. And so that makes this museum an early example of this kind of architecture. Nieland and Millet were charting a bold course with the design of this museum. Now, the Cromwell firm had used the tensile cable concept once before on a much smaller scale, and with the circular design in the 1957 Union National Bank Drive-In building in Little Rock. The Museum of Automobiles is therefore quite important and quite early for the state of Arkansas. In order then to suspend the roof by cables across the 150-foot square space, which encompasses a quarter of a city block, Nieland, Millet, and Gatchel utilized a squared variation of a compression ring held aloft by four corner columns or pylons that are anchored in 20-foot cubes of concrete. If you go outside later on as you're leaving, you should look around and see the exterior of the architecture. Take a look at those corner columns that hold everything up. I also have, you can get a postcard like this here at the museum that gives you a good view of the exterior of the building and the roof from the top. And you can also see a version of the picture in your brochure that you received. These corner columns are then connected by cast concrete beams, which, under pressure from the weight of the roof, work as a compression ring to buttress the columns. Suspended from a 30-foot height at the top of the columns, the roof, clad with the membrane and copper sheets, drapes down from 24 high-strength bridge strand cables. You see the cables here, to the center, where it is 15 feet above the floor. A 1966 Bethlehem Steel ad boasted about their cables being used in the structure of the museum's roof and described it this way. Radiating from the four corner posts, the steel cables pass through a cruciform strut back to each adjacent corner post. The strut stabilizes the roof and divides it into four equal parts. A grid of wood purlins is connected to the cables and roofing is nailed over it. And in keeping with modern ideals, the structural elements are open to view. So we can make it out right here. We can see exactly how it's constructed. Very simple. Described as ultra-modern when it was created, the building quickly gained acclaim. It was featured in numerous publications, and descriptions of the new museum always mentioned the remarkable architecture alongside the attraction of the cars whenever they wrote about the museum. The Arkansas Democrat, for example, announcing the museum's opening in 1964, said, "The museum will interest ordinary visitors as well as architects, engineers, and museum curators. It's an innovation in museum design. It's a pleasure to see an imaginative design, practical and artistically frank in use of materials, as in the Automobile Museum that will be dedicated Sunday." It was intended to be a structure as progressive and iconic as the man who commissioned it. So for its importance as an early example of tensile cable construction in Arkansas, the Museum of Automobiles was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2018 with statewide significance.